There are some days that are noisy in D.C. and in the nation. Those words were spoken earlier today by U.S. Senator James Lankford in Washington following a shooting at a congressional baseball practice this morning. And the senator joins us from Washington via Skype. Senator, thank you for your time.
Yeah, glad to be able to be with you. Painful to be here.
I'll throw it over to you. What's the mood in Washington this afternoon? I understand that Representative Steve Scalise, the majority whip, is still in critical condition.
He is still in critical condition. He took quite a hit. So obviously everyone's very somber here. It's a lot of reflection that's going on, a lot of prayer for those individuals. It's interesting, as I walked through the hallway earlier this morning, I walked past several open doors, and the door was open and you could hear people inside gathering to be able to pray for what's happening. There have been several different prayer events where people were gathered together to be able to pray organized, but it's also informally happening. Steve Scalise is a very important member to the House of Representatives. He's the majority whip. He's very engaged in leadership. He's very beloved by a lot of people there. But you've also got staff. You've got two members of the Capitol Hill Police that were also not only incredibly heroic, but also injured in this time period. And so it's a painful, somber moment and a reminder again that we're just like every other American. We're out in the public. We interact with people. We have friends. We go places. But there is a unique risk that's also sitting out there.
Is that something you have spoken with your colleagues, perhaps an awareness of what may be out there?
Yeah, we all keep that awareness. And what's been odd is over the last several months, many members have had a dramatic increase in the number of death threats coming to their office.
Have you?
I won't talk about from me specifically. I try to leave that out
okay.
Whenever that comes up or doesn't. But I would say it's a pretty frequent conversation that comes up. Just the increase of the volume and the heat of the debate. We've also had an increase in death threats coming into many offices. We all kind of live with that, and you set it aside and to say these are individuals that are just not being controlled in their mouth and their words, or they're writing things they shouldn't write. And then you have a day like today and you realize, no, some people really mean it. And so it does change the tone somewhat.
Something else you mentioned this morning in your address is, and I'll quote you on this, once again, remember we're a nation that solves things by conversation. We disagree, that's okay. We said that for 2 centuries. We can disagree, but we don't solve it this way, and we cannot.
And we should not. Obviously, there are lots of areas we're going to disagree on, and that's okay. When you're all in the family, you can have disagreements on things. We as a nation don't see the same. We see a lot of the same end, but we don't see how to get there the same a lot of times. So for us, that's okay. We can have that ongoing dialogue. When it reaches this level of heat and rhetoric and anger, and people begin to lash out, we have a whole different set of issues. This is one of the reasons a year and a half ago, we started what we call the Solution Sundays, to be able to encourage people that don't typically sit down together to not only sit down together, but to become friends together. We started on the issue of race, and I still think it's exceptionally important for us in dealing with race relations in Oklahoma and in America. And we started with just a simple challenge. If you've never had a family of another race in your home for a meal, why haven't you done that? That should be the most simple, basic thing, and it challenges us to say, how shallow are my friendships and relationships with people of another race that have never had someone from another race, their family, in my home? Many people have said, couldn't that work Democrat, Republican? Can that work with every different differences? Sure it can. And it's one of those simple things that I say, we've got to stop just being isolated, and I listen to my social media and attack everyone else's, you listen to yours, and we attack everyone else's. And actually get a chance to actually sit down and say, we probably agree on more than we disagree on. Let's sit down and actually get to know each other rather than just attack each other.
The congressional baseball game, one last question on this, is an annual deal. It's actually a fundraiser, supposed to be played tomorrow night at Nationals Ballpark. I assume that's a chance for both sides to kind of get together as well.
It is, and it's been a charity game. It's been around for decades. To have this charity baseball game, Republicans against Democrats, in a big league park with a bunch of folks that may be big league in politics, but they're definitely minor league in baseball. And so it's a funny game to be able to watch because you see all the errors and everything else with people that are not used to being on that time, or they were big time baseball players in high school a long time ago, but not so much now. It does add a little bit of an extra dimension to this game in particular, but they're going to continue to do it.
Have you ever played in this baseball game?
I have not. I played in the band in high school. I should not play on the field, I can assure you.
Fair enough. We're talking with U.S. Senator James Lankford. Yesterday, you spoke in the Comey hearing committee with Attorney General Jeff Sessions. From your take, what did you hear? How'd that go?
Jeff was actually very frank. It was very interesting even in his opening statement that he was very clear to say there is no collusion. I didn't collude. All these accusations that every time I met a Russian was secretly trying to collude is absurd. He doesn't like the innuendo that's constantly laid out there from unnamed sources and other individuals, and he feels like it's a distraction to what's going on. I completely understand all those things. It was good for Jeff to be able to come and to be able to lay that out as Attorney General and to be able to say, this is what really happens. I understand there are media sources trying to create the image that maybe something different happened. This is what really happened. And he opened himself up for questions. It was interesting to me. There were some members that were trying to get to private conversations between he and the president. That's never been appropriate. Republican or Democrat, private conversations with cabinet officials with a president doesn't come out into the media. And they were trying to create some sort of image that he's holding something back. I tried to remind them, hey, Eric Holder did the same thing with President Obama, and it was appropriate when Eric Holder did that with Obama. It's appropriate now for the current Attorney General with President Trump. You don't ask a cabinet official to reveal private conversations with the president. But we do need to know the basic facts of this to be able to deal with any kind of Russian collusion issues. Jeff Comey and his relationship with, Jim Comey and his relationship with Jeff Sessions, and any interactions they had and why Comey was fired, and if Jeff was a part of that and why, and then anything else that we want to be able to grab on the periphery to say these are significant in our investigation to grab just additional facts.
You bring up a good point there. As taxpayers, citizens of the U.S., when we see these sessions, if you will, what should we be paying attention to, and what should we see as, okay, that's just some political play at work here?
Yeah, so there are three basic questions we're trying to resolve. Did the Russians try to interfere in our election? There's no question they were trying to do that. The second question was any American working with the Russians to interfere in our election. That's a very serious issue, and it needs to be resolved. And we need to know that's counterintelligence. That's already illegal. And then we have the issues of classified information getting out in the public arena. That's also a criminal act if anyone takes classified information and puts it out. A fourth issue has been added of late, and that is obstruction of justice. Was the White House trying to stop the investigation and using their influence to try to shut down an investigation, or was the White House simply being attentive to what was happening there, as any White House you would assume would? Those are four serious questions. All four of them have got to be resolved in a bipartisan manner, looking at the facts, not what unnamed sources in the media at some point put out there, but what are the real facts and how do we gather it?
And this would play into elections in the future as well, including in 2020.
Exceptionally significant, the 2018 election even, which is not a presidential year, but if the Russians are trying to interfere in our elections, you assume they're trying to interfere in as many elections, as many places as they possibly can. I think some Americans have a misnomer on why the Russians engage in this. Sometimes they engage because they're trying to put someone in office that obviously is more beneficial to them, but more often than not, the Russians are just trying to sow discord in nations. Nations they disagree with, they try to diminish their power by causing chaos within their political structure. And so they'll basically, fund and help as many different people as they can to be able to see what they can do to sow discord. They were engaged in the presidential race, even in, for instance, Bernie Sanders' election, to be able to find ways to be able to help Bernie Sanders because he was an outsider running against an insider. That brought instability to the Democrat Party, so they were all in for that. They seemed to be all in for Trump because he's an outsider, again, running against insiders. There's not a sense that they're trying to actually get a certain person in. It's more of a sense of what can we do to disrupt what's happening in a nation that we try to compete with. And so we're trying to track that. There's no reason to doubt they're going to try to do it again in 2018. So we have to find out how they're doing it and try to find ways to be able to stop it, or at least expose it to the American people so they can see it for what it is.
You may not be able to answer this question, but if then what? If you find the Russians are involved, then what happens?
Yeah, I have no question the Russians were trying to interfere in our election. I just have no question. The next question is a policy question. What do we do about that? How do you respond back to the Russians? We had a vote today that started down the road towards sanctions to be able to add additional sanctions to the Russians. That's a beginning point for us of how do we start putting up a hedge to say we're going to make sure that they're held to account, that there are consequences if they try to interfere in our sovereign nation, and that we continue to be able to press that. And then the White House ultimately, with our foreign affairs folks, will have to determine what is the next step after that. This is not talking about trying to go to war with Russia, but it is an aggressive act when the Russians reach into our nation and try to interfere in our inner processes that we determine as Americans.
Very good. I'll move on. Something else you introduced earlier this week, the Eliminating Federal Tax Subsidies for Stadiums Act. What is that about?
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward piece. Steve Russell actually has that in the House. I have it in the Senate. And this just asks the question, should the federal taxpayer help pay for stadium construction in different large football, basketball arenas, whatever it may be? That should the federal taxpayer do that? In Oklahoma City, when we wanted to be able to have a professional, initially hockey team and then basketball teams, what we determined what we're going to do as a city, we did that as a city, and as a state, we didn't have federal tax dollars that came in on it. There's no reason for the people of Oklahoma to help pay for a new stadium, a football stadium. It's a multi-billion-dollar facility for a business. Ultimately, it's a sport, but it's also a business that comes into New York or California or Kansas City. Why are Oklahoma taxpayers being asked to be able to pay for those? So we're dealing with the subsidies and the tax credits that go towards the construction of stadiums. It's a small tax piece, but I think it's indicative of something that's a larger problem. Why is one state being asked to pay for something that's uniquely beneficial only to that state? And why should we have federal tax dollars to be able to flow from our state to them for something that only helps them?
Chatting via Skype with U.S. Senator James Lankford. He's in Washington today, busy day in that area. Over the weekend, he was in Oklahoma City. I saw you at the Oklahoma Press Association convention. Let me ask you one thing you mentioned there on the topic of privatization of the FAA. You say it's an acquisition problem. Do you want to expand on that?
It's very interesting. The president came out and said we need to deal with privatization of employees, and he meant towers and other things for the FAA, when really the problem that he then described after that was really an acquisition problem. How do we hire or how do we buy certain products, not how do we hire certain people? So I don't think you solve the acquisition problem. How do we buy products for the FAA by changing the employees that are actually in the tower, moving them from government to private? There is a major problem in how things are purchased in the FAA. It takes too long. The technology's behind by the time it actually gets into the tower. That does need to be resolved. But again, if we're going to resolve the acquisition issues, let's solve how we actually buy products, not just change the people in the tower who they work for.
Another topic you mentioned on Saturday was healthcare. You mentioned, in fact, to something you mentioned in this interview earlier today on healthcare, that this isn't Obama's legacy, and then you mentioned a couple of deadlines, July and then August. Where are we at on healthcare?
So the healthcare debate, I even had someone that caught me earlier this morning, and what we do on Wednesday morning, something called Java with James, just any Oklahoman that's in D.C. On vacation or trips or whatever they may be can stop by our office on Wednesday mornings. We have coffee and just get a chance to talk about whatever they want to talk about. One of the issues that came up this morning again was the healthcare. What's going on? There's this misnomer that the healthcare fight is all a political fight, and this is about taking down President Obama's legacy. That has nothing to do with it. The Obamacare thought and the basis of it is not a bad thought. It is how do we help more people get into the safety net to be able to be protected on healthcare, and how do we bring down the cost. The problem wasn't the original thought of it, it was the execution of it. The execution was terrible. We have about 9 million people that are now on the exchanges, many of them for the first time they have insurance, but you have 6.5 million people that most of those had insurance and that have lost it now. So we basically switched who has insurance and who doesn't have insurance anymore. And the cost has skyrocketed. In Oklahoma, the cost went up 76% last year alone. To put that in perspective, there's a lot of complaint about the growth in the cost of higher education and of colleges. It's grown about 75% in 15 years. Healthcare in Oklahoma went up 76% in 1 year. So it didn't stop the cost curve. So to us, we're trying to deal with this in a very pragmatic way. This is not a political argument. This is how do we solve the issues of pre-existing conditions to make sure people are still protected? How do we deal with the rising cost of healthcare to try to get that cost actually to slow down and to decrease? How do we make sure that there is a safety net for those that absolutely need that safety net in healthcare, and try to be able to do that in a way that will actually work in our healthcare system? So they're very pragmatic, very difficult conversations that are going on. But we have had working meetings every day just on the healthcare issue with all Republican members of the Senate trying to work our way through this for several weeks. We will continue to do that. We're working with outside experts to be able to pull in accounting issues all the way through it to make sure that we're actually following through on good principles, and then we'll be able to bring it out. We'd hope to have it done by July the 4th. I'm exceptionally doubtful of that. That was kind of our hallelujah goal, to have it done by that point. It's very slow getting the scoring from CBO. It takes several weeks. Every time we make a change, it's a couple of weeks to be able to get an answer back. So it's going to be more likely to try to get this done by the first week of August.
One last point with you, Senator. You and your colleagues, your congressional delegation colleagues on Saturday indicated that there was a lot of work going on in Washington. Representative Markwayne Mullin and Representative Steve Russell specifically said, hey, we've been busy doing work. That the case?
It is the case, actually. It's interesting. I had a member of the national media that caught me about 2 weeks ago and said, with the Russia investigation consuming anything, can you get anything else done? And I smiled at them and said, actually, you're the only one talking about the Russia investigation wall to wall all the time. I'm working on it some because I'm on the Intelligence Committee, so it's a major part of my work. We're working on healthcare issues. We're working on tax policy. We're working on the spending issues and appropriations, working on oversight for federal employees and how we're handling those criteria. I've got another hearing on that tomorrow. We're dealing with small business issues. I just released a small business bill dealing with trying to give first-time offenses for someone who had a paperwork violation. Instead of having a fine, they get a warning and they get greater input before regulations are actually created if you're a small business. All those things are the things that are actually consuming our time. It just has the appearance that we're only dealing with Russia because that's all that's presented on the national media. That's not true in the day-to-day what's actually going on here.
I remember you joked about that on Saturday, that Oklahomans were concerned about Bob Stoops, maybe not so much Russia.
Exactly right. Lots of folks said, is everyone consumed with Jim Comey? I said, not at home. Everybody's talking about Bob Stoops right now.
Senator Lankford, thank you so much for your time. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.